This is Kyle Hyman, and with us today is Dr. David Anders. You might know him from the popular show Called to Communion, which you can hear here on Redeemer Radio weekdays at 2 p.m. Today he comes talking with us about how the Catholic Church saved his marriage. Thanks for being here, Dr. Anders.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
I think a lot of people that know of you and know of your show Called to Communion might just think of you as this friendly, faith-filled professor who helps us work through our questions about our faith. I might be surprised to hear the opening line of your book, which says, "The Catholic Church saved my marriage and quite possibly my life." So can you give us a little background on yourself and maybe give us a little timeline for your life, including your conversion and your marriage and some of the struggles there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation. So I grew up a Christian. I grew up a Protestant, a Presbyterian, and I thought that I knew everything there was that I needed to know about the Christian faith and about marriage. And I went to Christian college, Wheaton College, where I studied theology, church history. And I planned to be a professor, probably in a Protestant seminary or a Protestant Bible college. And in preparation for that task, I thought it was really nothing better I could do than study the thought of the fellows that I considered to be the fathers of the church, Martin Luther and John Calvin, the great Protestant theologians, founders of the Protestant tradition.
Yeah.
And of course, they spent a lot of their time attacking the Catholic faith. And like a good disciple, I was learning to do likewise. I thought that refuting Catholicism was sort of the ideal form that theological reflection should take. And I actually wrote a doctoral dissertation on Calvin's critique of late medieval Catholic spirituality. But two things happened during that process. One of them is I began to lose my faith in the Protestant tradition. And the other one is that my marriage began to fall apart. Because though I thought I knew everything about the Christian faith and about marriage, I came to realize that I knew some things about Christian marriage. I didn't know enough. And one of the things I didn't know, for example, I didn't really have a clear idea about marriage as an ecclesial state of life, as a Christian vocation, as my primary vocation. And I tended to conflate my professional aspirations as a theologian with my life as a Christian. And that was a very sophisticated way, or maybe a not sophisticated way, of justifying the neglect of my wife and my kids and my pursuit of my professional pride. And so it's no small wonder that with that kind of attitude that I grew farther from my wife and she grew further from me until we found ourselves really in mutual acrimony and with very little to hold us together except our children and wedding vows that each of us began increasingly to regret. And at the same time, I was losing my faith in the Christian tradition. I was losing my faith in Christ, in the Bible, because the way I had understood that all of my life long was shown to be incoherent, irrational, unhistorical, unbiblical, and I was at a loss. And so by around 1999 or 2000, I was at a point in my life where I was really kind of hoping that one of us would get hit by a bus, and I didn't really care which one.
Wow.
That's where we were.
So did you have any hope at that point? Had you tried different things like counseling to try to make things better?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I appreciate it. To make counseling work, you have to be able to find enough agreement to get in the same car and go to the same counseling office, or at least to show up at the same counseling office at the same time. And our situation was such that I don't think we could have mustered that much common ground. And so, no, we really didn't. And, if you read to the end of the book and, things today are fantastic and wonderful. I love the Catholic faith. The Catholic faith saved me for the Christian faith. And it also saved my marriage. My wife and I love each other very, very much and have a great relationship. But I say at one point in the book that it wasn't counseling or therapy that saved our marriage. It was red tape and a canon lawyer. And I mean that quite seriously. And one of the lessons that I want people to get out of the book is that for a Christian, for a Catholic, there are two kinds of marriage. There's natural marriage, which is, the marriage of two pagans, two Buddhists, two atheists. And it's fine. It's a good thing. God created natural marriage. But then there's sacramental marriage, the marriage of two baptized people, where Christ comes to the heart of the union and indwells the couple and their common life together and elevates that relationship to the dignity of a sacrament and gives grace to help us with our state of life so that we can bring our spouse and ourselves to heaven and our children and witness that love. It's kicked up a notch significantly to the supernatural realm from natural marriage. And as a Christian vocation, as an ecclesial state of life, it participates in the paschal mystery of Christ. And that necessarily entails suffering. Jesus said if we want to be his disciples, we have to take up our cross and follow him. If we don't do that, we can't be his disciples. Like Our Lady, when she was confronted with some pretty awful prophecies, if you think about what it entailed for her life, her response was, "Be it done to me according to thy word." Or our Lord, confronted with the awful horror of the crucifixion, said, "Not my will, but thine be done. I've come not to do my own will," he said, "but the will of him who sent me." And that's the heart of every true Christian disciple. Yes, you should love your wife. You should love your husband. Marriage promises the possibility of great happiness, but it assuredly promises the certainty of great pain and suffering. Of what it may not be suffering inflicted directly by your spouse on you, although it might take that form. Could be the loss of a child. Could be desperate circumstances. Could be the sacrifice of ambition or hopes or pleasures as you seek the welfare of your kids. But it will come with suffering, and an unwillingness to embrace that means that you're dead in the water. You're not going to get the thing off the ground.
Yeah.
And I think for us, when we came to really wrap our heads around the nature of salvation, the nature of the sacraments, the nature of the sacrament of matrimony, we eventually had our marriage convalidated in the church. And we recognized at that point, this is not just some loosey-goosey romance. This is a commitment to follow the way of the cross. And that's the kind of reality that it takes, I think, to fully embrace and benefit from the grace of the sacrament.
So how long was your marriage struggling, would you say?
To be honest with you, we were very immature when we got married. I met my wife when I was 19 years old. She was 19 years old. Actually, she was 18 years old. And we were married by the time we were 21. We graduated from college in 3 years. And I think we took our degree in May. And then we set our wedding promises in July of that year, 1992. So while there was a lot of that youthful passion and romance floating around, there was an awful lot of confusion and pain and unfulfilled expectations right off the bat. But we had few enough responsibilities and enough common interests that we had a lot of good times together nonetheless. But as the seriousness of life kicked in pretty shortly thereafter, and financial pressures, work pressures, and then ultimately more graduate school, and then pressures of parenthood and child rearing, it gradually began to creep up on us. And the misunderstanding, the acrimony, the mutual distrust simply grew and grew and grew until it reached really a breaking point. And that was after, I guess somewhere between 7, 8, 9 years into the marriage is when we really hit the nadir, the low point.
Yeah. We're talking with Dr. David Anders. The book is The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage, Discovering Hidden Grace in the Sacrament of Matrimony. And would you say that it was an understanding of the church's teaching and kind of a theological understanding that helped your marriage, or was it actual practical things that you were able to implement into your marriage that made it better?
Well, the story is a little bit different for me and for my wife.
Okay.
For me, as I mentioned, my descent to the abyss was twofold. It was the loss of my faith and the loss of my marriage. And my climbing out of the abyss, or God pulling me out of it, was connected to regaining both of those things. One of the key issues for me as a Protestant theologian was the doctrine of justification by faith alone, this very traditional Protestant view that we're saved simply by an act of faith in Christ's atoning death on our behalf, and not by any works or any change in our moral character. That might follow, but it's not necessary for the assurance of salvation. And that belief fell apart on me intellectually, but also fell apart on me existentially, because as I grew into adulthood, I realized that faith alone was not sufficient to sustain me for the moral challenges of my life, in particular, my marriage. And so as I began to study and learn about the Catholic faith and see the sense in it, and was ultimately persuaded of the truth of the Catholic faith, I realized intellectually that the Catholic faith was true, but also realized in a deep spiritual sense that I needed the grace the Catholic Church offered. I needed that interior moral renovation promised through the sacraments, or I was never going to make it. And so I became Catholic in an act of faith, trusting that God would in fact deliver those things. And he followed through. He began to, and I'm not claiming that I'm any kind of moral exemplar today, but he did change my life. He began to work on me and change my character and the way I thought about moral action and moral decision making and my reliance upon grace. My whole attitude towards the moral life began to change. And I think that's when the glimmer of hope emerged. It was faint, it was far off, it was in the midst of a lot of suffering. But as I began to see a real difference in my life, I thought this might possibly work in the life of my wife as well. And I urged her to come to the sacraments, to come to Christ in the Catholic faith. And she resisted that for a long time. And finally, I kind of badgered her into the confessional. She'd been a cradle Catholic as a child, so it was just a matter of her coming back to confession. And I got her to go to confession to Father Angelus Shaughnessy, OFM Capuchin Franciscan friar who was at EWTN at the time. And she didn't want to go, but she went, and then she went back. And then she went back, and she went back, and she went back, and she went back. And then one day I wake up in the middle of the night, and I see Jill praying the rosary in the middle of the room. And I thought, where did this come from? And the next thing I know, she's in daily mass, and then she's more Catholic than the Pope, as they say. And I asked her years later, I said, what happened to you? What did Father Angelus say to you in that confessional? And she said to me, he told me something that no one had ever told me before. He told me that my suffering had meaning. He told me my suffering had meaning. And for Jill, it was the discovery of the crucified Christ. And in the Catholic mystical tradition of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, that she began to take a different perspective. See, the world tells you to run from suffering at every turn.
Right.
And if your marriage is a difficult one, if there's pain or sorrow, then you should bolt. You should get out of there and go find something that makes you happy. That's not the Catholic view at all. The Catholic view is that we can transcend suffering by passing through it in imitation of Christ and make it into something holy and offering to God and gain sanctification. And she began to experience that in her life of prayer, following the way of Teresa of Avila and the Carmelite spirituality. And the transformation in her life was 180 degrees. It was night and day. It was miraculous. And people around her marveled at the difference in her character and her attitude and her outlook on life. She began to forgive everybody that had ever offended her and to ask forgiveness in turn. And of course, that included me. And so because of the grace of the confessional, it led ultimately to the reconciliation of my marriage.
So would you say your book is mostly for marriages that are already struggling, or do you think it could also serve as a way of avoid falling into some of the struggles in the first place?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. The book is really, it has a wide audience because I've heard from people who are lifelong Catholics that have been married for 30 years who have written me and said, I thought I understood the Catholic doctrine of marriage, and then I read the book, and now I see there's a lot I was missing. And this has really deepened an already good relationship. And I've heard from others that have said, my marriage is falling apart, and this book is really speaking to me. And a big source of tension in my marriage was the change of my religious views. And being drawn to Catholicism was a major source of contention for a long time. That's a very common experience among people who begin to explore the Catholic faith and they have a spouse that's not on board with them. And I think this book could give hope to people in that situation as well. And I've heard from those who have experienced that. They said, you've spoken to something that I'm going through. I think the book would be helpful for people who are not Catholic, in particular Protestant Christians, who are interested in knowing what are the differences between the Protestant and the Catholic doctrines of marriage and why should I care? I think it would be good for marriage preparation, and I think it would be good for those in struggling marriages as well.
Another thing that you talk about is your upbringing and that of your wife and how that impacted your marriage and your view on marriage. Do you have any advice for parents on how to raise kids with a proper understanding of marriage and sexuality?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the question. I think the biggest missing piece in the rearing of children today, I know it's true in my experience, and I think it's true culturally, is the lack of emphasis on virtue formation, on character formation, habits of virtuous life. And, there was a time in human history when parents brought children to maturity by living and working alongside of them and modeling the virtues. And that time is gone because parents today, by and large, work outside of the home. They may have professional lives. Kids grow up in daycare and public school and in front of the television, and they're often brought to maturity by their peers. And so it's not uncommon for parents and children to live in separate cultural worlds. And you see that reflected in popular films like The Hunger Games or Divergent, where the adults are the bad guys and the children band together to fight against the tyranny of the older generation.
Right.
That way of life is tragic. That's tragic. And I think the Catholic faith tells us that the life of the virtues is essential. So bring your kids to work alongside them. Let them see you exercise the virtues in your own life and insist that they do likewise. That's critical. And then, of course, a vigorous practice of the sacramental life and a keen awareness of the influence of Christ at every moment on my life, on my behavior, and on my outlook, and in particular on my marriage. My mother, wonderful woman, not Catholic, but she used to joke and say, murder maybe, divorce never. And we laugh at that, but that's one great gift that my parents gave me, an awareness that no matter what happened and no matter how bad it got, I could always depend on the fact that mom and dad would be together come hell or high water.
Yeah.
And I think it's the greatest gift he ever gave me. And I think if you find yourself in a struggling marriage and you think, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Christ laid down his life to die a death of torture for the sake of his bride, the church. You should be willing to do the same for the sake of your children. Even if your spouse is a real so-and-so, it's not about you. It's about the kids.
Yeah.
To quote the politician, it's about the children. And if you don't have that conviction, then you don't understand what parenthood or what marriage is all about. If you can give your children that rock-solid assurance that everything in the world may fail, but not the fidelity of my parents one to the other, you will have given them something that will carry them to eternity.
Well, I know this is going to help so many people. So where can people get a copy of the book?
Thank you. We would really appreciate it if you would buy it from the EWTN Religious Catalog. That is, if you buy it directly from EWTN, you will help support the ministry of the network. Mm-hmm. You can also buy it from the distributor, which is Sophia Institute Press. But, of course, if you would like to buy it from the major retailers, it's also available. You can order it from Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and it's also available in paper and in ebook format.
All right, again, it's called The Catholic Church Saved My Marriage, Discovering Hidden Grace in the Sacrament of Matrimony. Thank you so much, Dr. David Anders, for sharing some of your story with us and for putting this book together. I think it's going to help a lot of people.
I really appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation.